Your Eminences, Reverend Fathers, and distinguished colleagues, what view should Orthodox take of human rights? Any answer to this question must take account of at least two factors: which rights are in question and how they are justified. Many rights that are widely advocated today are antithetical to Orthodox moral teaching. Most obviously, these include such alleged rights as those to abortion, same-sex marriage, and so-called gender transition. However, even if a right is fully consonant with orthodoxy, the reasoning by which it is justified may be unacceptable in other ways. John Locke, for instance, justifies the right to life by arguing that human beings are God's property, so that to kill another human being is a kind of theft from God. He thus posits ownership as a defining relationship between God and humanity. He makes no mention of what Scripture regards as the primary reason for the special value of human life, our being made in the image and likeness of God. Thus, from an Orthodox standpoint, he comes to the right conclusion through the wrong means. Despite such unpromising precedents, I believe that Orthodoxy can and should affirm human rights in some form. My aim here will be to offer a framework for doing so. Although my comments will be brief, I hope they may be helpful in orienting our thought on this subject. As I will understand them here, human rights are defined by three interlocking qualities. They are natural, that is, inherent in human beings; equal, the same for everyone; and universal, applicable everywhere. Each of these terms requires clarification. Saying that human rights are natural does not commit one to a particular conception of human nature. It merely means that they accompany the status of human being, however that is understood. Perhaps more surprisingly, to say that they are equal and universal does not imply that they are applicable to all persons in the same way. Violating the law can lead to the loss of some human rights, such as those to freedom of movement, but not to that of others, such as the rights to be free of torture and slavery. More remarkably, the application of even such basic rights as those of life and freedom may depend on morally arbitrary factors. This is evident in the case of the military draft, which requires healthy young men to sacrifice their freedom and potentially their lives for the good of others. The continuing prevalence of the draft shows that even such important rights as those to life and liberty are held only subject to severe qualifications. Human rights are thus far from absolute. Perhaps the best one can say is that in recognizing something as a human right, a nation or other entity declares it to be a high priority goal that is to be realized in law so far as resources and circumstances permit. Of course, resources are finite, so in practice, decisions have to be made about which rights will receive priority. This points to another way in which human rights are not absolute. Not only is their supposed universality highly qualified, decisions have to be made among them based on criteria other than rights themselves. Human rights discourse is thus intrinsically limited. It is very far from a complete system of morality. Its role is merely to provide some moral guidance that states are obligated to respect, subject to pervasive and often unstated qualifications. Human rights are often justified by an appeal to human dignity. I believe that this is correct as far as it goes, but by itself it tells us little. What, after all, is human dignity? Those who believe in rights to abortion and so on often justify them in precisely this way. For them, to accord people dignity means to allow them those things they feel they need in order to lead rich and fulfilling lives. And abortion, same-sex marriage, and the rest fall into this category. Others see human dignity as entailing the right to death with dignity, to use recreational drugs, and to engage in consensual pedophilia. It is hard to know where such new rights will end. One can readily envision similar claims being made for the right to radically transformative plastic surgery, or various forms of transhumanist self-enhancement. Or perhaps as sex bots develop, a right will be declared to technologically enabled sexual gratification. Insofar as the concept of human dignity depends on what human beings find gives meaning and value to their lives, It is as malleable as is human desire itself. From an Orthodox Christian standpoint, it is helpful in seeking the proper role of human dignity to consider an inverse notion, that of defilement. Jesus said that out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. St. Paul similarly warns against the defilement of the body through sexual sin. He considers a clean conscience of such inestimable value that he directs the Christians at Corinth not to eat meat offered to idols, lest they wound the conscience of their brethren. We see here that dignity has two faces. There is the dignity that one is accorded by others, including the various forms of respect and equal treatment that are of concern for advocates of human rights. But there is also the dignity that one has as a moral being who is responsible before God. St. Paul's concern about the conscience is that the inner conviction of guilt, even if it is mistaken, may hinder a person's ability to stand before God openly, freely, and without shame. All the more is this true of sins such as those mentioned by Jesus. These truly do bring shame before God, for they are defilement of the precious gift of life. The contrast between these two kinds of dignity is central to the Christian message. At the crucifixion, Jesus was stripped of all merely human dignity, yet it was precisely in accepting this condition that he manifested what it is to have true dignity before God. The gospel is full of such inversions of merely human and true human dignity. He who is first shall be last. The greatest among you must be servant of all. Unless you become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Part of what is odd about the modern understanding of human rights is how casually it invokes the notion of human dignity, historically rooted as it is in the belief that humanity is made for communion with God, while ignoring the moral and spiritual dignity through which this communion is realized. The latter comes only in understanding oneself as answerable before God and made for communion with Him. To some extent, this form of dignity is in tension with merely human dignity, for to be concerned with the respect one is accorded by others is precisely not to place one's hope solely upon God. In reality, of course, every Christian is in the world but not of the world, so that some concern for merely human dignity is inevitable, if not for oneself, then for others whom one is obligated to protect. Scripture provides a model of such concern in the zeal of the prophets on behalf of the poor. Even so, the tension between merely human dignity and true human dignity must not be overlooked. To do so can readily lead to the collapse of the moral and spiritual into the merely human, thereby reducing Christianity to a system of this worldly ethics. The recognition of these two kinds of dignity suggests a parallel distinction among two kinds of rights. Merely human dignity is important, to be sure, but it must be understood in accordance with its biblical and patristic sources, not conflated with the satisfaction of human desires. As for true human dignity, clearly no human agency can force someone to accept his true vocation before God. Yet politics may be important in a different way. It can open up the space in which persons are able to seek God and do their best to obey His commands. Not all will take advantage of this opportunity, but without it, spiritual life can hardly begin. Let us call rights that help ensure the opportunity to seek God and live according to His will rights of agency. Most obviously, these include the rights of freedom of religion and conscience. Less obviously, but no less important, they include the right of children to be raised in a way that is morally sound and helps prepare them for the responsibilities of adulthood. What further rights should be recognized depends on what precisely are to be understood as God-given duties. To focus on just two that are mentioned in Scripture, those to care for the poor and to provide for one's family, the corresponding rights include those to earn a living, to better oneself through economic enterprise, to be free of crime and exorbitant taxation, and to defend oneself and one's family when the state fails to do so. Other duties, such as those to share the gospel and to help those in need, imply various further rights, such as those to free speech, public assembly, political participation, and redress of grievances. For present purposes, the important point is that the relevant rights do not aim to protect comfort, security, or happiness, but the ability to act responsibly before God. Many of the rights so indicated will be familiar, but they may well be less expansive than is commonly supposed. Most importantly, since they are justified only on a moral and spiritual basis, they will not in general extend to the protection of sin. So the right of free speech, for example, does not extend to the making of pornography, and that to make a living does not extend to work as a drug dealer or prostitute. Nor will the rights to privacy and bodily autonomy extend to such acts as abortion, suicide, same-sex intercourse, self-mutilation, and pederasty. Such activities may be permitted as a matter of positive law, but they are decidedly not human rights. A second class of rights aims to protect what I have called merely human dignity. Rights of this sort include those not to be subject to rape, torture, cruel and unusual punishment, slavery, or bodily mutilation. These overlap with the rights of agency, for often an assault on dignity also inhibits effective agency. But this is not always the case. A single act of rape or torture may not significantly inhibit agency, but it is nonetheless a violation of human rights simply in virtue of what the victim has suffered, without regard to further considerations. The same is true of some acts of bodily harm, such as female genital mutilation. We may call such rights rights of non-abuse. I choose this clumsy term to highlight that the rights in question are merely negative, in the sense that they protect against certain forms of abuse, but do not establish a protected scope of action, as do rights of agency. They are accordingly much narrower in scope than the rights typically justified by appeals to human dignity. An Orthodox approach to human rights, while not eschewing the concept of human dignity, must interpret it within a biblical context and in light of the priority of divine commands. Merely human dignity thus consists primarily in the right not to be assaulted or violated in ways that are divinely forbidden. I would propose that these two categories of rights, with their biblical and patristic rationale, constitute the basic framework for an orthodox approach to human rights. Only such a framework can ensure that human rights do not come to overshadow the moral and spiritual basis that gives them legitimacy. Thank you.